All right, welcome to UPARS Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. This is November 2019. We have an exceptional guest with us tonight. His name is Paul Davids. Having now reached his 70s, noted producer, director Paul Davids states that his life experiences include a variety of mind-boggling incidents that defy scientific understanding. After graduating from Princeton University with a degree in psychology and completing a fellowship at the American Film Institute Center for Advanced Film Studies, Paul became a filmmaker of motion pictures that go to the heart of what those interested in UFOs, alternative history, and the paranormal are seeking. His 1987 daylight saucer sighting with his two children became a catalyst for him to become the co-writer and executive producer of Showtime's Roswell, the UFO Cover-up in 1994. He also had experiences including physical evidence that suggest afterlife or spirit world communications. His interests expanded over the years to include all types of paranormal phenomenon: reincarnation, deep hypnosis, ghosts, spirits, shamanism, synchronicities, psychedelic experiences, and even apparitions of the Virgin Mary, Jesus' missing years, and other biblical mysteries. And Paul's brought with him several of the movies he's made, including the one about Jesus. The name of it is Jesus in India, which looks enthralling. He also wrote a book on his years at Princeton and the psychic experiments that were performed on him. Anyway, he's a very, very interesting man, and I'm so glad that he's here with us today. Would you guys put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Paul Davids?
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I think that I'm going to take you through a sort of a roller coaster ride that's a bit different from a lot of the talks that you've heard here. It was about a month and a half ago. I was invited to be a speaker in Durham, North Carolina for an organization called Academy for Spiritual and Consciousness Studies. And they knew of my intense background with UFOs, but also these paranormal events. And they asked for a sort of all-encompassing talk because they were particularly curious: how does somebody become a filmmaker such as myself that makes so many films on so many unusual topics? What was the driving force? What was my motivation? And so there's a lot of personal element in what I'm going to share with you tonight, but I call it Motion Pictures and Non-Conventional Consciousness because we're going to be talking a lot about film, about films, many of which you've seen, and films that I've made on a whole variety of topics that I think are covered under the paranormal or non-conventional consciousness. So let's begin. So I've been in the motion picture business since about 1975. I've had a vast array of experiences, and I've had the good fortune to work with some of the greats, including George Powell. How many of you know who producer George Powell is? The War of the Worlds, The Time Machine, The Conquest of Space, Destination Moon, and on and on and on. Robert Wise, William Wyler, who made Ben-Hur, Max von Sydow, John Huston. I've worked with really some of the greats through the years in many capacities. Well, let's get to this difficult word in our topic, consciousness. Tried to define it, and this was the best I could do: the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings, the fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world, the awareness or perception of something by a person. What about non-conventional consciousness? So this is, to me, the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings in an unusual or extraordinary way. The fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world in a much less limited way than is usual in ordinary consciousness, and expanded perception, awareness, or thought, and awareness of things ordinarily considered paranormal or inexplicable by conventional logical thinking. I've had a lot of influences in my life that brought me here. I came from a very straight background. Both my parents were teachers. My mother taught 5th grade in Maryland. My father was a college professor of American diplomatic history at Georgetown University. And my parents didn't practice any religion. They didn't believe in the paranormal. They didn't believe in UFOs. Anything unusual, any sort of unusual belief would kind of arouse their suspicion. So how did this develop for me? One influence was LSD in college at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute, where I was a subject in a program that was part of MK Ultra, but I didn't know that. I found out later. So there was the deep hypnosis at NJNPI, the reading of Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. Absolutely profound book. The skeptic reads it and rebels against the possibility of a lot of the things that he says, and yet the whole texture of the writing, the tone, the integrity, the honesty of the man, you just can't believe that he's making anything up, but some of it is just so hard to believe. So I went along on that journey. And I've lived within a mile or so of the mother center of his Self-Realization Fellowship. I've lived there for now about 40 years. This was a turning point, meeting psychic Dorothy Allison. I was a segment producer on F. Lee Bailey's television series Lie Detector. And I met the most extraordinary psychic and did a segment with her. More about that later. In the introduction, it was mentioned I had a 1987 close daylight flying saucer sighting with my 2 children. I had extraordinary experiences in India in 2005 while making the film Jesus in India. And then there's this man, Forrest J. Ackerman, you're going to be hearing a lot about. How many of you know who Forrest Ackerman is? A lot of you. All right. We'll get into that later. He was someone who was so close to me, a mentor for half a century. And I met him when I was still a teenager. He had a profound effect on my life. So those were things you're going to hear more about. How do I break down paranormal themes in film? This is my list. It would include films about afterlife communication, returning from the dead, demonic possession. There have been films about the devil taking the identity of a human being, dream invasion, the invasion into someone's dream, ghosts, the theme of heaven, films about mediums, mind reading, near-death experience, Ouija boards, poltergeists, psychedelics, and psychokinesis, moving an object with your mind, reincarnation, all themes that have shown up in various films. Religious revelations, shamanism, time travel via consciousness, transcendence, UFOs, and religious miracles. So that's sort of the panoply. We're going to be looking at what films have dealt with those topics. And a lot of those topics were very frowned upon. Restrictions against putting them into production, a natural tendency to stop them from getting made in a formative or development stage. I mentioned here there's also the practice of debunking, which can include ridicule, attempting to make aspects of non-conventional consciousness appear to be foolish, naive, untrue. And sometimes, though rarely, cinema uses drama for the purpose of discrediting or debunking these themes. Now, that's an interesting development too. Cinema has treated these themes in a range of styles, from comedy to fantasy, to science fiction, to horror, to drama, sometimes pure entertainment, but occasionally very serious and thought-provoking. So let's go through some of these films. I'm going to be reminding you, I think, of some that you will have seen, others you may be hearing of for the first time. The film Hereafter and the films Dragonfly were both very, very serious films that dealt with contact with departed people on the other side. White Noise, Afterlife Communication, EVP. How many of you know what EVP, electronic voice phenomena, is? It's when you are making a recording and something shows up in your recording that doesn't belong there, usually a voice, often saying something that you can identify, and you don't know where it came from because there was no one there who said those words at the time. I made a film on the subject of afterlife. I called it The Life After Death Project. The reason I called it that was that I was working on this project for years, and everybody said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what it's going to be called, but it's my Life After Death Project." So the title stuck. I do have DVDs of this here, and I want to mention there's a part 1 and a part 2 in there. The first part was shown on the Sci-Fi Channel, and then the second part is a continuation of what was in the first part. One of the gentlemen who helped me with this film and who was involved in experiencing phenomena talked about in this film is here tonight, a dear friend and producer, Sean Fernald. Sean, would you stand for just a minute so they'll know who you are? Thank you. Sean was also a very dear friend of Forrest J. Ackerman, who we call Forry. You'll be hearing more about him. Returning from the Dead, so I chose Boris Karloff, The Mummy, and one of my films does involve that theme, but in a whimsical way. It's called Starry Night, and the premise was, what if Vincent van Gogh, who died thinking himself an utter abject failure, who sold one painting in his lifetime, what if he could come back today and discover how things turned out? I think his paintings today, the aggregate of them, would be probably worth more than $4 billion. And he made 100 francs from his career in his entire life. So it deals with what might happen to him if he came back and tried to collect his money. He'd need a lawyer. And Sally Kirkland is very good in this movie. She plays an art detective who's very skeptical of this man who calls himself Vincent van Gogh, and she thinks he's a homeless, psychotic con man and an art thief, and she's out to get him. So that's the dramatic conflict. Consciousness and concentration resulting in time travel, Somewhere in Time, such a beautiful movie by Richard Matheson, based on his book Bid Time Return, where the device for the time travel is concentration on a penny that has a date that goes way, way, way back. I don't remember, there's a century-old penny, but by staring at the penny, the main character, played by Christopher Reeve, wanted to meet an actress who had lived and died a century before. He felt that he was in love with her, that they were soulmates, and if only he could go back in time and really meet her. And Richard Matheson has made that possible in that story. Fabulous story. Demonic possession, a subject that doesn't interest me particularly, but boy, The Exorcist was a hit, wasn't it? And so was the Amityville Horror. The Devil Taking the Form of a Person, Frederick March in Death Takes a Holiday. Meet Joe Black, the remake with Brad Pitt. And then there was the musical. How many of you remember Damn Yankees? This was making a bargain with the devil. Dream Invasion, the incredibly brilliant movie Inception, which is about traveling into someone's dream within a dream within a dream, layers of dreams in order to affect certain things that have to do with espionage. And similarly, Dreamscape dealt with that theme. Ghosts, so many movies deal with ghosts. Christmas Carol, course, from Charles Dickens. It's been done so many times. The very well-done movie called Ghost, Beetlejuice, different kind of take, Ghostbusters. You know, it may have been sort of a parody and a send-up, but it had a lot of elements in the plot that relate to real ghost research, including ectoplasm, right? The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, Topper, the comedy about the ghost man and woman living with a family. Heaven, very broad concept, means a lot of different things to different people. Carousel took the meaning of heaven very literally. Billy, I forget his last name. Billy is given a second chance at life, and he meets with the head honchos in heaven, and they send him back to earth to take a look at his loved ones and what they're doing now. And then Heaven Can Wait, very successful film. So Beyond Heaven, other concepts of life and death, The Sixth Sense. What Dreams May Come is another one from Richard Matheson, who did Somewhere in Time, and it was his interpretation of the afterlife. I interviewed him for my film, The Life After Death Project. He's deceased now, but I had an opportunity with him during the last couple of years of his life, and he saw afterlife as being a very, he called it sort of a personal experience. He felt it would be different for each of us based upon our psychology and life experiences, tailor-made for us. Interesting idea. Mediums. How many of you saw You Will Meet a Tall, Dark Stranger? It's a Woody Allen movie. Okay, well, I thought it was a terrific movie. I mean, it has about 20 really normal characters in it, and then it has a mother who is all caught up with a spiritualist who's advising her, and she's following everything this medium tells her to do, including how to invest her money and withholding money from her children if their investments psychically don't seem like they're going to be good. And she's been told she'll meet a tall, dark stranger. There'll be love again for her. And she meets a man who owns a psychic bookstore. And I think what's so funny about this movie is that of the 20 characters Woody Allen follows that all should have successful lives, they all have completely shattered lives in this movie. And the two that end up happy at the end are the lady who follows the psychic and the owner of the psychic bookstore. They're the only ones that have true happiness. Near-death experience, we've got Flatliners. I mean, it's in a massive amount of films on these themes, and we haven't even gotten to UFOs yet. Mind reading, Village of the Damned, a UFO film about a type of alien abduction, well, the impregnation by aliens of an entire community. And the children have this group mind-reading telepathy capacity. There's like 20 children, and they are like of one mind. They all know exactly the same thing and think exactly the same thing at the same moment. Ouija boards, not one of my favorite topics, but it became a movie. Origin of Evil. Premonitions. There was the movie Premonition. And why do I include Close Encounters of the Third Kind under premonitions? Does anybody think they know? There's a famous scene. Mashed potatoes. Yes. He doesn't know why, Richard Dreyfuss doesn't know why he's moved to build this mountain of a certain shape out of mashed potatoes, but it is a premonition of the fact that he's supposed to go to Devil's Tower. Very effective. Psychokinesis and telekinesis, like moving objects with your mind. Well, Star Wars, Luke reaching for the lightsaber that's buried in the snow in The Empire Strikes Back, and his mind pulls it to him through the power of the Force. And why is this book called The Glove of Darth Vader here? Well, among my professional things on my resume, it includes the fact that my wife and I were contracted by Lucasfilm to write 6 of the Star Wars sequel books. So I'm the co-author of The Glove of Darth Vader, The Lost City of the Jedi, Zorba the Hutt's Revenge, Mission from Mount Yoda, Queen of the Empire, rounding out with Prophets of the Dark Side. It's quite an experience in the early 90s. The book sold many millions of copies. It was a peak moment in my career because it was right around the time when Roswell was approved for production. It was all happening at once. More telekinesis, psychokinesis in Carrie, poltergeists. We got the movie Poltergeist, the recent movie Crimson Peak. I went to school at AFI with Matthew Robbins, who was a screenwriter, and that was Guillermo del Toro's movie. A lot of poltergeists. Psychedelic drugs. The Trip by Roger Corman with Peter Fonda, that goes back to, I think, the late 1960s or early 1970s. And Timothy Leary's Dead is another film I produced and directed. And it's a documentary about LSD promoter, Harvard guru, Timothy Leary, a biography of Leary that I filmed with him the last year of his life. Extraordinary adventure and opportunity. And actually, I was able to get that opportunity, and he trusted me partially because I had worked at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute under Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist who coined the term psychedelic, and he was close to Timothy Leary. So it was like, okay, I was family. Here's two films that deal seriously with the theme of reincarnation. Unmistaken Child, the Buddhist lamas who search for the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. I mean, this is real. They interview how many children until they can find the one who they think is the embodiment of the deceased Dalai Lama, his reincarnation, literally. Audrey Rose had the reincarnation theme. These were comedies on that theme. Chances Are, Steve Martin in All of Me, and Barbra Streisand in On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. I think back when that became popular, when that was made, On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, it was during an era when, if it wasn't for the fact it was a major musical and Barbra Streisand got involved, it wouldn't have been made because of its theme. I mean, it was that era where Hollywood felt it had to cater to sort of the mainstream beliefs. And since reincarnation was outside of that, there was the feeling that that was a negative strike against the movie before it was even released. So at some point, those kind of walls against most of these themes broke down. Religious revelation, Jesus of Nazareth, and the Passion of the Christ, which was viciously attacked, by the way. Paul Schrader, another of my fellow classmates from the American Film Institute, wrote that screenplay. And as for Jesus of Nazareth, no, wait a minute. No, hold on. I've got something backwards. It's The Passion is the one with Mel Gibson. The Passion was turned down by every single distributor in Hollywood. They all told Mel Gibson no. I think it ended up making about $1 billion. And I mean, just think how many secretaries could have gotten a $100 a week raise, if one of those major studios, all the pundits there, they all know, right? It's like they knew that Star Wars was going to fail. They knew it. They had George Lucas in a state of mind of panicking before the movie opened because the executives at Fox had seen it and they knew it was going to be a disaster. But they saw it without John Williams' music. The music hadn't been added yet. They just saw the dry movie. And as a matter of fact, I know Andy Rigrod was George Lucas's lawyer at that time. He was been a friend for many years, and he negotiated George Lucas's deal. And when he asked for the merchandising rights, that Lucas wanted to keep those, asked for those in the deal, Fox said, "Take them, they're yours. Not going to be worth a dime." So a lot of pundits don't have very good premonition. I think that's the... Two of my films that deal with religious revelation. Before We Say Goodbye, it's based on a stage play. It's an all Hispanic American cast. Stage play was called We Are Hispanic American Women, okay? And okay was part of the title. We called it Before We Say Goodbye because we got a wonderful song from Rebecca Del Rio, and this has to do with the theme of the film. Before the grandmother's husband dies, what needs to happen? And, I'm not a Catholic. My father taught at Georgetown, a Catholic university. So I grew up with great respect for the Jesuits, and it was always, a part of my life. And I've always been fascinated by many of the Catholic miracles, the reported sightings of the Virgin Mary, Fatima. And as for the Virgin of Guadalupe, this is the Mexican Catholic miracle. And it's a fascinating miracle. The movie is not a documentary about that. It's a story about a grandmother who devoutly believes in the Virgin of Guadalupe and that she will solve any problem in her life. And she's not correct, but her faith leads her in very interesting directions. We were able to film in the Basilica of the Virgin in Mexico City. And the actual miracle, the story goes back to 1511, I think it is, where a peasant who has since been sainted saw a lady from heaven who imprinted her image on his cactus cloak. And the image is still there today. Like more than 500 years later, scientists said the cactus cloak itself should have disintegrated in like 75 years. The image shouldn't still be there, but it is behind glass in that basilica, and nobody can explain it. And the story about, the lady from heaven asked him to talk to, I think it was the Archbishop in Mexico, and to have a church built in her name there at that site where she appeared. And it happened. So it's an interesting story. It's one of my films. It's a family movie. It's one, if you have, your mother would love it. Jesus in India was one of the greatest adventures of my filmmaking career. I spent 6 weeks in India filming it. I also filmed at the Vatican and at Princeton University and Georgetown University with the religious scholars. Elaine Pagels is in it. And I have a lot of religious, quote-unquote, superstars in it. For example, there's Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who was the head Vatican exorcist, and he was apostolic nuncio for John Paul II. He's in the movie. I was able to gain an audience that I was told you will never, never get this interview, but I did, with the, let's call him the Pope of Hinduism. His title is Shankaracharya, and he's the leader, spiritual leader of 1 billion Hindus, and I was able to talk to him about, was Jesus in India? There's this theory that during the missing years of Christ, not accounted for in the Bible from age 12 to 30, 18 years, it's accounted for in one sentence in the New Testament. And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with man and God. That's all it has to say about those 18 years of the life of Christ. And in India, there's a strong conviction that during those years, Jesus took the Silk Road to India. They even claim that the 3 wise men, we 3 kings of Orient were from India, and that gold, incense, and myrrh were gifts that the rishis of India would bestow upon holy personages. And a man named Ed Martin wrote a book about this. I got to know Ed, and we went to India to make the movie together to follow this cold case and see, can evidence be found for this theory after 2,000 years? Because there were stories of ancient documents in a Buddhist monastery in Ladakh, way up in the mountains, that filled in those years. And we were in search of that manuscript, and information about those who swore they had seen it and translated it through the years. Fascinating adventure, which ended in Kashmir. Very dangerous place to be for an American at the time that we were there. So I think you'll find that interesting. Shamanism, I made a film called The Artist and the Shaman. Here's another movie called The Last Shaman. By the way, The Artist and the Shaman is very personal again. I am an artist. And there was a phase of my life around the year 2000 when I spent a summer in Sedona with a shaman, Rahilio, who took me out to all of the sacred sites to suggest what I should paint, where the spirits of his ancestors would come through to me. And I would paint for hours on end, and he would perform ceremonies with a drum and a flute and chanting, and it was all filmed. And there was the tantalizing aspect that because he was living in a house he was renting from me, and his son had been conceived in that house, and my father, who had died a few years before this, had been in that house, we were asking the question, was his little boy, 3 years old, the reincarnation of my father? It was an idea, an impression. There were things about the boy that made me think that. Things not in the movie even that made me think that. I'm not so sure. He's now in his teens. He's a filmmaker, the boy Tonatiu. But again, it was another fascinating adventure. Oh, transcendence. Well, I put this in here because I think some films can help you transcend, and I feel that dance is one route to reach transcendence. There's all kinds of dance. I wrote the film She Dances Alone, Bud Cort, Max von Sydow. It was about Kira Nijinsky, the daughter of the great ballet dancer Vaslav Nijinsky. But in another sense, dance, Michael Flatley, how many of you know Michael Flatley, who he is? Okay, a small smattering of you. He's Irish. He is an absolutely stupendous dancer. Was involved with the creation of River Dance. And he has DVDs like Feet of Flames, Lord of the Dance. He staged these huge productions with 100 dancers all at once, and they are staggering. And there's so much energy in those Michael Flatley DVDs. I do the treadmill frequently. I try to do like 40 minutes at a time, and it's a good exercise program, but you get very, very bored if you're just doing that. But when I watch Michael Flatley and all his dancers, and I'm trying to keep up with their energy, what I'm saying is that the movie brings an energy to you that really lifts you up and helps you reach a state of transcendence so that you can have a peak performance. All right, now we're at UFOs. Took us a long time to get there, but this might be alphabetical. There have been over 600 feature films involving extraterrestrials. 600. And those would include good films, bad films, and ugly films. And great films. Those 600 films have grossed billions of dollars. They have become one of America's major exports to the rest of the world and a major part of U.S. economy. Right, so here's E.T. We've already talked about Close Encounters. Fire in the Sky, based on the real-life incident of the abduction of Travis Walton. I've known Travis for many years. I have no doubt that Travis was abducted, and there were six or seven witnesses to it. They were all loggers. His fellow loggers saw it happen. And when they came back and reported Travis missing, the law felt that they had killed him, probably buried him in the woods. This was a case of murder, and this ridiculous story of UFO abduction, they felt had no merit. But the 6 witnesses all underwent lie detector tests. 5 of them passed as truthful, and the other was inconclusive. But the head of the American Polygraph Association at that time, Edward Gelb, stated that there was one chance in a million or less that 5 people who are lying could pass a lie detector test. Travis's story is absolutely true, and a vicious debunker pursued him for years, trying to tear him down and the story down any way that he could. It was really an ugly example of debunking. It was a kind of harassment. My most famous film having to do with UFOs is Showtime's Roswell, with Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, and Dwight Yoakam. It's the story of the Roswell incident as told by whistleblowers who came forward about 30 years after the fact. They'd been sworn to secrecy. I also made the Sci-Fi Boys, which deals heavily with that theme, but it's also, that is mainly the history of special effects in movies from the early days to today, and it's hosted by Peter Jackson of The Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and King Kong. Oh, knowing too much about UFOs. We all know what the men in black will do to you. Poof, memory erasure. My most recent film, Marilyn Monroe Declassified, also has a UFO angle. You may not know that there is a CIA document that talks about, through wiretaps, the CIA's concern of pillow talk with JFK, what Marilyn Monroe had learned that was classified, including something about JFK's visit to a secret airbase for the purpose of examining things from outer space. It's in the CIA document. And she was murdered the day after this document was signed. I say murdered. Most people think that she committed suicide. I don't accept that at all. And the movie dissects the events of her death in meticulous detail. And everyone who's seen it says, you proved she was murdered. You told us who did it. You told us how. You told us why. It's fascinating. The movie's also a tribute to her life, her career, her fabulous films. But she was a controversial figure. And she married Arthur Miller, who was a communist. And this was during the days of the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was not a good position to be in. I talked about skeptics and what they can sometimes do to the subject. And here's 2 really good examples, both of them really fine films. Well, Vertigo. Have you all seen Hitchcock's Vertigo? Everyone knows Vertigo. So you know that it was set up as a sort of a scam to gaslight Jimmy Stewart, make him convinced that the woman he had been hired to follow as a detective, Kim Novak, was believed that she was the reincarnation of a woman in a painting. And this was, the information he was given about this and the trail of evidence to convince him all the further was all a setup. It wasn't true at all, but it was designed to put him in a certain place at a certain time to be a witness to her apparent suicide. It was a setup. So in fact, it sort of takes advantage of the theory of reincarnation in a debunking way. Magic in the Moonlight is another Woody Allen masterpiece, I think. Woody Allen isn't what you would necessarily call a believer in much of anything, but in this movie, he does quite a job on psychic premonitions, mind reading. There's a character who is thought to have extraordinary mind reading talents, and there's a skeptic who absolutely will do anything to prove that she's faking. And you find out, spoiler alert, she is faking, but she takes him on a ride where this major skeptic actually becomes a believer that she really has the ability. So it's a bit cynical in its theme, but it's extremely well done. So I'm going to begin to get a little more personal now. We've sort of scanned this canvas of films from Hollywood, and then including some of mine. I said when I spoke at ASCSI, they asked, how did I become a filmmaker emphasizing these themes? By the way, that's me with my sister. I think I was probably almost 4 and she was less than 1. Her name is Jeannie. Throughout my life, inexplicable events began happening to me. And over time, these led me to look beyond the materialistic, the anti-religious, the purely scientific, rational approach by which I was brought up. I want to begin by talking about one of these personal events that boggles my mind to this day. That's me with my mother, Frances, and the other picture in black and white is my mother and father, Jules Davids and Frances Davids. Well, this was on the day of their engagement in 1941. There were a few pictures taken that day near Brooklyn College, Brooklyn. This picture is one of the strangest things in my life. I'd like to point out a few things. Notice that the yellow sticky that says Brooklyn College is completely in focus. And the word engaged written at the bottom of the photo is in perfect focus. And 1940 at the top, written in the album, perfect focus. But what is wrong with this picture? It's a long list of things that are strange about this picture. You look at my father's left arm, he has 2 left arms. One's in his lap, the other's at his side. It's moving. Well, no, I don't think so, because you'll look at parts of the picture and see it doesn't seem to be double exposed. I don't want to say yes or no to anything. I just want to build the mystery a little bit to say that my father, his face, when you look at it closely, and I'll show you a close-up, he has 2 noses. One was his nose as it looked as a young man, and the other is his nose as it looked as he was a much older person. My mother's pendant is doubled. It's just a little bit ajar. You see 2 of them. But my father, his tie is tripled. There's 3 ties there. Now, the most troubling thing about this picture that was taken in 1940 is what is in between my father and my mother's head. There's a little bubble there. And I want to say, because I've got to say this now, with utmost sincerity, I'm telling you the absolute sworn truth on every aspect of every one of these seemingly paranormal things that I've experienced. I'm not exaggerating. I haven't made anything up. This picture was never subjected to Photoshop or anything like that. It was simply scanned, and then this was a JPEG file. But what's in that bubble between my mother and father? Oh, this is to show the Brooklyn College. You see they're holding hands. I do have another picture of them taken maybe 30 seconds before that's completely normal, where their hands are close together but not touching. So this is the moment my mother makes physical contact. She either reaches for his hand or he reaches for hers, and physical intimacy is suggested by that. Now here, in between, is me as a child and my sister as a child. I was not conceived yet, and neither was she. That's exactly what we look like. Oh, by the way, I've looked through hundreds of family photos, trying to find a photo of myself and my sister that would represent that, and I can't find anything that's that. Now, above, there is the ghostly image of a blonde woman. Can you see her head? You can see her hair. You can sort of see the part. You can see her nose. There's a bar, right, blocking off part of her face. I have no idea who that is. But here you can see more clearly. My father has 2 ears. You see, separated a lot there. But you say, could it be double exposure? Well, no, because look at my mother's collar. The left collar doesn't show double exposure at all. And why does she just have 1.5 pendants and he has 3 ties? And you can see the nose looks different there in 2 positions. There's no explanation for this 1940 photo. There's an ultra close-up. And that was me as a boy, and that was my sister as a little girl. I haven't got a clue, but I will say this, that when I was putting together an album for my mother a few years before she died of the family photos, and I was scanning everything, and when I scanned this, and then I printed it out, I printed out everything, and I looked at it, and I didn't look at it carefully. And I just said, well, that picture's screwed up. Do I want to tear it up and throw it away? No, it's part of the family record, I'll keep it. It wasn't for another 10 years that I discovered what was in this picture when I took a closer look. I might never have discovered it. More personal stuff. How many of you have heard the expression pennies from heaven? Okay, and there's a Steve Martin movie, Pennies from Heaven, there's the song. It's sort of an old wives' tale that goes like this. It's sometimes when someone dies, they send pennies from heaven. And when my mother died, my sister and I had the most inexplicable experiences of pennies showing up in the strangest places where they shouldn't be there. Because when we looked at that spot 15 seconds ago, there wasn't a penny there. And a penny would show up. We had a photo of my mother that we used at her memorial. And on the anniversary of her death in my sister's home, a penny shows up right by that photo. My sister doesn't have a maid. No one else comes into their house. She's had so many pennies show up in her house. You know, she's had things of vacuuming a rug. She's been over the whole rug. And then 10 minutes later, she goes in and she sees a penny. Or the same, she makes a bed. 10 minutes later, comes in and there's a penny right on the bedspread. And I've had so many penny incidents myself. Well, it was some time after my mother's death that I opened a drawer and I pulled out this little purse. And I remembered, oh, my mother gave that to me. Why did she give it to me? Well, my father had Alzheimer's in his final years. And before he went into a home full time, he would go to a place they called the Fellowship House, which was sort of like daycare for Alzheimer's patients. And my mother said he always wanted to have some money on him. So she had this purse, and as you can see, she filled it with those pennies and left me a note explaining that these were the pennies, the everyday supply of pennies that he would take. So these pennies had started showing up, and then it was, I don't know, a month or 2 months later, I discovered this note inside the purse. So she's established this contact with me, that pennies are something important, and pennies have something to do with my father. This was one penny that showed up, you know, sort of standing up on edge. And I found that the day I watched an old Twilight Zone, which is about a penny that stands on edge. You guys remember that Twilight Zone? And then my sister was searching for memorabilia for my mother, old photos, and she moved some plastic bins. And in the closet, there was this plastic bin, and it had all these pennies on top. She had no idea how it got there. Then she saw that black spot on the wall. She said, "What's that? How did that get there?" And then she looked at it closely. She saw it was a quarter. It was stuck to the wall. And she just touched it lightly, and it dropped. And she picked it up, and she tried to get it to stick to the wall again. Nothing. No way. She could never get it to stick to the wall again. What was it doing there? I mean, it starts to feel like a communication. This happened to me. I don't know how this green Monopoly house showed up on my desk. And it was right in between the printer and the scanner. But it showed up just after my wife and I had put in a bid on another house that we wanted to get in Santa Fe. I'll wake up in the morning, I come down, and then there's a Monopoly house right there. It's like somebody's trying to tell you, watching you, see what you're doing. I don't know. I listed here some possible catalysts to how someone can come around to starting to believe that these otherworldly things are possible and happen. Unusual experience that defies society's norms and conventional beliefs. Well, I've barely begun to tell you how that has impacted me, because there's one case involving Forrest J. Ackerman that became my movie, The Life After Death Project, which involved what could be 100 instances of contact or communication from deceased spirit. Barely begun. But none of this even occurred to me until later in life. I mean, I think when I was 40, I was still the deeply skeptical agnostic that my parents were. Other things that could influence an unconventional upbringing: psychedelic or mind-manifesting drugs. A lot of people are trying ayahuasca, DMT. There's peyote, there's psilocybin mushrooms, LSD. These things have absolutely powerful, unexpected, unanticipated effects on consciousness that are of fairly short duration, but maybe not so much, because sometimes 8 or 10 or 12 hours. And they bring about absolutely profound and long-lasting changes in consciousness. And they're all against the law, except for mushrooms in Colorado now. Not allowed to sell them, but it's not criminal to possess them. If you're caught with them, they'll take them away from you. Varieties of spiritual or religious experience. Varieties of spiritual or religious experience also bring about profound change. And these things happen. Again, I go back to the Yogananda book, Autobiography of a Yogi. I recommend it to everyone. And then intensive academic study of non-conventional phenomena could be a catalyst for interest and even belief. But there's nothing like having something happen to you that you can't explain. When I was young, I was surrounded by art, including these pictures, one by Picasso, one by Van Gogh, the Gypsy Wagon, the Acrobat, the Young Harlequin. This was me at age 8. And there were a lot of fascinating things going on in my family, because my father, who had taught Jackie Kennedy at Georgetown University, was summoned through Ted Sorensen to meet with Senator Ted Kennedy, who had an idea for a book about profiles in courage. This was really interesting because my dad's lectures at Georgetown that Jackie attended were profiles in courage. But independently, JFK came up with that idea, and he commissioned my father to do some writing. The question of who would be the best senators to deal with in the book. My dad had strong ideas about that, and they were all used. And this is my dad fulfilling his work for John F. Kennedy. He actually wrote a treatment for 5 of the 9 chapters. I won't say ghost wrote, because his words weren't used in the final book, but he provided the historical content, what the issues were, what the conflicts. And then John F. Kennedy, who claimed to have actually written the text of the book himself, he dramatized all of this historical material, and very well, because it won a Pulitzer Prize, and it put him in a position to get the Democratic nomination in 1960, because it propelled it. He just gotten a Pulitzer Prize for Profiles in Courage. And my dad was completely silent then about his contribution to it. He's mentioned in the preface that he had contributed materially to several chapters, whatever that means. And now, today, finally, after keeping my dad's writing under wraps for many, many years, the John F. Kennedy Library does release to the public, to those that want to see it, the writing my dad did on Profiles in Courage. So there's the book. That's my dad on his manual typewriter working on it. He later wrote a book called America and the World of Our Time. Here's Profiles in Courage, Changed the World. And in Parade, that my dad was credited Ted Sorensen and my father with substantial writing. I'm going to go quickly through some of these slides quick as we can, and we have a lot of ground to cover. This was my dad's book later. I've talked about my upbringing. The only hint of what would become my unusual career path was the fact that I made monster movies when I was a kid. That's me at the left, and this is my best buddy from 3rd grade. I want you to remember his name, because we're going to come back to Jeff Tinsley. We were inseparable. We made monster movies together starting when we were in about 5th or 6th grade. And these are some scenes. That was my sea beast. It was pretty sophisticated. Stop motion animation. I built that model. And me posing as Gulliver, picking up a friend. This is the kinds of things we would do. And we came to the attention of the Evening Star, which was one of Washington, D.C.'s 2 major papers at that time. And they did a whole page about these movies that we were making. That's me with the camera. It's Jeff. We have an animation model there. Our friend Bill Goodwin in the background. It's 3 of our little group of 5. I directed almost all of these little films. And I mentioned Forrest J. Ackerman, such a major influence in my life. Here he is with Steven Spielberg. This was him and his wife one day, many, many years after I had met him, and he's in my home at one of my birthday parties. But I met Forrest J. Ackerman when I was like 13. Jeff's father saw that Ackerman was at the World Science Fiction Convention downtown in Washington, and he knew our obsession for the famous Monsters magazine, and he said, "You boys have got to meet this man. I hope he'll meet you. I'm taking you down there." So he took us to the Statler Hilton, and by George, we met Forrest J. Ackerman, who was so nice when he heard that we made these movies. Actually, this was the day we met him, and that's him standing with the name tag, but in the background, that's Jeff standing with both of his hands on the table like that, and that's me by the 8mm projector back there. Actually, this was the day after we met him, because the day we met him and he told him about the movies, he said, "Why don't you come back the next day, bring a projector, and bring some of the movies. I'm going to have a lot of the fans there. I'm sure they'd like to see your movies." And that's Jeff's dad that took us there. Well, we entered a contest that his magazine ran, and here was the envelope telling me, master movie maker Paul Davids, that I was a winner in the contest. Now, I'd like you to notice 2 things about this because they became important 40 years later. Just like some things in that photo I showed you became important because I hadn't even been born yet. Here, one of the stamps is Edgar Allan Poe, and the other is the Palace of the Governors of Santa Fe. At that time, I'd never been west of Virginia, I think, maybe Ohio. So they published us in Famous Monsters magazine, and there's me and Jeff and our pictures as winners. And it had a profound influence because with that kind of reinforcement and encouragement at that age, I was convinced that my destiny was to become a Hollywood producer, probably of monster movies, right? And I had a lot of distractions along the way because I went to Princeton. I ended up pre-med. There were a lot of things pushing me away from doing that, which I did end up doing. Here's something else about my upbringing. I grew up very near the grave of F. Scott Fitzgerald in Rockville, Maryland. He was another major influence in my life. I was a winner of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Literary Award at Princeton. And there did become parallels. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby, which sold very little during his lifetime. He died at age 44, and The Gatsby was a failure. It was a critical success, but it was a failure. Today, they say The Great Gatsby has sold more copies than any other fiction book ever written. That's right. So there were parallels that developed. For example, F. Scott went to France, Paris. I worked in Paris when I was at Princeton. He went to Hollywood to become a screenwriter. I went to Hollywood to become a screenwriter. Most of his movies were never produced at all. Most of my movies, believe it or not, were never produced at all. Many scripts are gathering dust still. There's F. Scott Fitzgerald, and he was a Princeton graduate. He actually never graduated. He left before graduating, but he was a Princeton man. So unusual parallels. That's The Great Gatsby. This was me on the verge of going off to Princeton with my father. Princeton was the University of Tradition. That's Nassau Hall. It was the headquarters during the Revolutionary War. I lived in that room, in that building, Witherspoon Hall. That's the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award that I won. And my wife and I named our kids after, our son is Scott for F. Scott Fitzgerald. And F. Scott Fitzgerald was named after Francis Scott Key, Star Spangled Banner. Our daughter Jordan is named after the character Jordan Baker in The Great Gatsby. It was at Princeton I discovered the autobiography of a yogi. I mentioned that. And at Princeton, I discovered the psychedelic experience and Timothy Leary. It wasn't all tradition. I ended up as a volunteer at the New Jersey Neuropsych Institute. That's Humphrey Osmond, who ran the program. He's the one that turned Aldous Huxley on to mescaline, which resulted in the book, The Doors of Perception. And that's where the group The Doors, took their name. So there's Aldous Huxley, and there's The Doors of Perception. This was the creepy, lonely building where I and a group of about 15 others, maybe 20, underwent deep hypnosis experiments regularly while we were college students, and also LSD experiments. 10 years later, it was revealed that that was part of MK Ultra. We didn't know for 10 years. CIA tells Columbia University and Princeton of the secret behavioral research that took place at their universities. This editorial, The CIA Blowing America's Mind, we adapted this headline, Blowing America's Mind, to be the title of a book I co-authored with one of the fellows who was actually a hypnotist, my hypnotist at the Institute. We wrote a book. I have some copies. This was that fellow, John Selby, and he has written like 40 books. He is so incredibly prolific. More headlines about that program. The CIA seeking an amnesia drug, like in Men in Black. It was 1968. I was in London. I saw the premiere of Yellow Submarine. And it was the following morning I decided, after seeing that film, that I couldn't possibly go ahead with the plan to go to medical school. I was going back to my original love, movies. I had to do things that were as creative and brilliant as the Yellow Submarine. And I decided I would go to Hollywood after graduation, and I didn't know anybody there except Fari Ackerman. Didn't know what would lie before me. But I applied to the American Film Institute and provided some of these stop-motion monster movies that I had made. And after graduating, George Stevens Jr. accepted me as one of the first 15 students at their Center for Advanced Film Studies, which was remarkable. There were applicants from all around the world. I was just straight out of Princeton. And I was one of the 15 anointed ones. There was no tuition charged. They provided a production budget for a first 16 millimeter sound movie, which I made there. It's called Examination. There I am, just a few weeks ago, back at the Greystone Mansion, which housed the AFI. I'm there with George Stevens Jr., who was head of the AFI for many years. This is that Greystone Mansion. I was a student there for a couple of years, and we had access to lots of top people in Hollywood. And that's when I met Robert Wise. That's when I met George Powell, who commissioned me to write The Hobbit, the story of The Hobbit. But we were way ahead of our time. It didn't get made then. It had to wait decades until Peter Jackson came along. More shots of Greystone. This was in Christian Science Monitor. That was me as a student there at Greystone. That was me making my first film at Greystone. And we had a reunion there of the first class. By the way, the people I went to school with in class there included David Lynch, Caleb Deschanel, who is probably the most important cinematographer in Hollywood. Matthew Robbins has directed many films. Paul Schrader wrote Raging Bull, Taxi Driver. I mean, he's written so many great films. He and Martin Scorsese rose together. Jeremy Kagan, who's directed so many films. I know I'm leaving out. Oh, Terrence Malick was a big new picture coming out now. He was one of the first 15. We were all there together, just as students. And David Lynch, he was the weirdest one of the bunch. No one would have voted him most likely to succeed. Oh, while I was there, I went on the dating game. And I was bachelor number 3, and Karen Carpenter didn't pick me. Years later, she sang Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft. How many of you know that song? Okay, a very famous song. I was put on this Warner Brothers movie as an intern, Dealing, the Berkeley to Boston 40 Brick Lost Bag Blues. And while working on that film in Boston, I met my wife, Hollis, sort of by chance. It's a really interesting story because she was just passing me on the street. And I threw her a line. And I threw her a line because I was with a friend from high school and I was showing him how to pick up girls. He hadn't had a date in a long time, and I was saying, well, you know, I'm a Hollywood guy now. I'll show you how it's done. So Hollis walked by carrying a box of enlarging paper from a darkroom, and I'm a darkroom guy. And that's what prompted me to throw her a line. And she had had a horoscope that day saying it was a good day for romance. Let's see, this will be our 48th anniversary, I think, coming up. Thank you. Hollis became senior vice president of Universal Pictures. She had never thought of working in the movies when I met her in Boston. She had a degree in psychology. First couple of years, she worked with children with learning disabilities. And then we got her in to work part-time at FilmX, which was the Los Angeles International Film Exposition. From there, she met people at Columbia Pictures. Eventually, they hired her as a publicist. She worked at Columbia for 10 years, and she was in charge of all the premieres, and then all of the premieres at Universal Pictures for like 25 years. And really, how I was able to have a successful career was that when I began making independent films on my own, with no studio backing, when the films were done, I took them to Universal. And I mean, at first they turned down my films like anybody else's, but then they had a reason to accept Starry Night, the first one, and then it was quite successful on television. And then they accepted the Sci-Fi Boys and Jesus in India, and the Life After Death project went onto their Sci-Fi channel. And so did I mention Jesus in India? It made my career possible. And they were honest with me. I never had a problem with any of the deals, and they made it possible for me to keep going. This is that book I was telling you about the MK Ultra experiences. We waited 50 years to publish it, actually. We hadn't finished it. We finally finished it 2 years ago and used all the real names. We couldn't have done that if we hadn't waited till everyone had passed away. I mentioned writing The Hobbit for George Pal. Breaking into the business was working for agent Paul Kohner for 5 years. Absolutely a great agent. Just absolutely a gentleman, a great businessman. And he represented most of the top talent from Europe. So we had Charles Bronson as a client, and Henry Fonda, John Huston, and Ingmar Bergman, on and on. And while I was there, I got to go down to Puerto Vallarta to be with John Huston a number of times. I worked part of the time for William Wyler, who directed Ben-Hur. What's going on here? Hello. John Huston on the cover of American Film. Some of his great films, he did a lot of films with Bogart. Treasure of Sierra Madre, and then Night of the Iguana with Richard Burton and Ava Gardner. He really, and Deborah Carr, he really discovered Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. He really put Puerto Vallarta on the map with Night of the Iguana, which he filmed in nearby Mismaloya. There's a statue to John Huston there now. So what I'm saying is that this contact that I was fortunate enough to have as my mentors so many of these greats, it opened doors, and it kept me going through all the years of rejection, because like everyone else, I went through many years of having all of my proposals rejected, nothing happening. It could be very, very discouraging. You know, I had years on unemployment waiting for things to happen. This was the first film I wrote that got made. I mentioned it before, under Transcendence, about Kieran Nijinsky. Oh, and I had adventures with Alistair MacLean, who we also represented. He wrote The Guns of Navarone. Had a fantastic trip to San Francisco with him. That's my wife with Alistair. Until Stephen King, Alistair was the best-selling male writer, period. His books just sold untold millions. And he never walked around with more than $30 in his wallet. I think if we went out to lunch, I had to pay. Now, this was a breakthrough experience that was, I think, my first exposure into the paranormal field, professionally. I was hired as a segment producer on F. Lee Bailey's Lie Detector. And I'm going to take you through this, and I think then we're going to take our little break. Lie Detector was on every day, syndicated show. People from around the country would write in and tell their story and say, I want to go on your show, give me the lie detector. I want everybody to know I was really telling the truth after all, that I didn't commit the crime, I didn't tell that lie to my boss, whatever it was. So we picked these different cases. And here, you see I'm credited one of the segment coordinators, which meant I would choose the cases, I would arrange for the people to fly out. And one of the cases I took, and this was kind of very pivotal and somewhat life-changing for me, because it was Dorothy Allison, the New Jersey psychic detective. Now, if you'd have asked me at that time, did I believe in psychics? I'd have said, probably not. Did I believe in communication with the dead? I'd have said, are you serious? Dorothy Allison had affidavits from police departments that she had helped solve crimes where there was a murder victim and the corpse had not been found. And they would put her in touch with the family members, and she'd want to touch an article of clothing of the deceased. And she would explain that images would come into her mind that she said were being planted there by the spirit of the deceased to show her where the body was. And I read these letters from these policemen, and they said, she solved this case, that case, that case. We found the body. And this most incredible case that she passed the lie detector test on our show. There had been a 14, I think she was 14 years old, girl missing, Long Island, and body never found, presumed murdered. And Dorothy Allison said, I see two bridges, one for cars, one for walking. She said, I see two church steeples. She said, I can smell oil. She said, I see these letters, M-A-R. I don't know what that means. March? I don't know. M-A-R. That's important. And she generated a few other clues. And the father hunted all over Long Island to try to find something that matched this. He hunted for at least a year, and he found a place where there were these old oil drums, and he saw the bridge for cars, the bridge for walking, the two church steeples, and on a boulder in red paint was graffiti, M-A-R. The body was not found there at first examination, but on second examination, coming back with some dogs, they led him and the police to the oil drum that his daughter's body was in. To me, this was really remarkable, because as a rational, skeptical person, you'd say, this was not coincidence. Okay, the clues are too specific. She didn't know any of the people involved. There must have been communication from the person who died, because the clues were so specific. She was picking this up, and she wasn't hearing voices, she was seeing pictures. This would mean that there had to be life after death, that the spirit of the murder victim had to have survived in some form and still have been communicating with this psychic who was intent on finding her body. So suddenly, to me, we had pierced a barrier in my consciousness. It had to be true. But this was 1983 for me. I didn't get involved in this subject again until 2009. So that's almost 25 years I left it untouched. And then things happened with Fari Ackerman where I couldn't ignore it. It became really personal as that photo I showed you where I'm in from 1940 with my parents, as personal as those pennies. It became one of the most extraordinary things in my life. We had left off with my experience with Dorothy Allison and the fact that it was many, many years before I revisited the subject of a psychic communicating with a deceased spirit. So this was 1983 for me. It's my first production coordinator gig. And I was very, very fortunate. In 1985, 2 years later, to be taken aboard at Marvel Productions as the production coordinator for all of the original Transformers cartoon episodes. I was the coordinator for 79 episodes. I was in at the recording sessions for almost all of those, including the one for the first animated Transformers movie that had Orson Welles playing the voice of the planet Unicron. But anyway, for a couple of years, everything for me was Optimus Prime and Megatron. I got to know Stan Lee. And then I wrote some of those Transformer shows. They accepted my script for Grimlock's New Brain, Chaos, The Thief in the Night, Cosmic Rust. And while I was at Marvel, I wrote my first book with my wife about the Hawaiian legends. It was a fantasy adventure, Mark Twain with the Hawaiian gods. And Stan Lee wrote the foreword to it. It's kind of rare and hard to find, but there are copies out there. And around that time, Arnold Leibovitz was making a documentary about the life of George Pal, who I admired so much. You know, study the films of George Pal. It was not only the great science fiction films, but also some great fantasy films like Tom Thumb, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. He was a great master, and he made all of the original Puppetoons. He was an original master of stop-motion animation who trained Ray Harryhausen, who became one of the greats of stop-motion. So that was like 1986, and the next pivotal event, which really changed my life, was 4:15 p.m., February 25th, 1987. That's when my daughter screamed at me from her room upstairs, and I was typing downstairs, and she said, "Daddy, get upstairs right now. I see a flying saucer." And I didn't really think flying saucers were real, and I screamed back at her, "I'm working. It's a Goodyear blimp. Take another look. You know what a Goodyear blimp looks like." "No, Daddy, get up here right now. I mean it. It's a flying saucer." So I ran up the stairs, colliding with my 6-year-old son, into my 9-year-old daughter's room, and we saw a flying saucer in broad daylight, making maneuvers close to our house. It descended from a cloud high above. We watched it for minutes, enough to make a lot of really close observations. These were the notes about my sighting when there was a report at the Center for UFO Studies. These were my notes on the sighting. On the right-hand side there, I listed all the specific things. It was soundless, didn't make a sound. There was no exhaust. There were no portholes. Classic saucer shape, a dome, like an upside-down soup bowl on top of an upside-down plate, meeting a right-side-up plate, meeting a shallow soup bowl. And it was very stable when it flew horizontally, but when it hovered in one position, it went like this. And I described it like if you spun a quarter on a desk. As the quarter is getting close to hitting the desk, it's that kind of a wobble. And I became so fascinated about UFOs. In the months following, I probably read hundreds of books about flying saucers, and I saw that wobble effect had been reported in saucer sightings going back to 1947. This was my son's notes, his drawing, and the wavy lines. It was his way of trying to show the wobble. That was my daughter's notes. As I say, I was absolutely fascinated, and I went in 1991 to the first World UFO Congress in Tucson, Arizona. Wendell Stevens was one of the sponsors. And if you look at the registration number on my certificate there, you'll see I was the first person to register, number 1. I got there early. I was first in line. And in researching, that was around when I was writing those 6 Star Wars books, too. That was 1991, 90. They came out starting 92, 93. So my career was on an upward path there. I learned about the Roswell incident. RAAF stands for Roswell Army Airfield. It's a real headline. Captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. It was released, it was announced, and within 24 hours it was retracted, it was debunked. It said, forget it, all a mistake, it was just a weather balloon. Well, it wasn't a weather balloon. It wasn't a mogul balloon. This man, Major Jesse Marcel, broke silence about 30 years later, said he'd been sworn to secrecy, and so had everyone else, and that the materials that he picked up from the crash debris were not made on Earth and could not have been made on Earth. He said he was familiar with all air materials. And that would include missiles. And Roswell was the base that then had the atomic bomb. It was the only base in the country that had the atomic bomb and the planes to fly them out. As a matter of fact, Colonel Blanchard, head of the base, was second in line if Tibbets hadn't been able to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. He would have been the base commander. This document about crashes of flying saucers in New Mexico and the little occupants being found is the most viewed memo on the FBI website. Well, my travels, my studies led me to meet at the right Donald Schmidt, at the left Kevin Randall. Don Schmidt was then head of investigations for the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies. If any of you are watching Project Blue Book, the series, you know who J. Allen Hynek is. Northwestern astronomer who was consultant to Blue Book. And Don came out and he did a report on my sighting. I will say that to meet Don, I had to go through a couple of steps. My wife set up an appointment for me to meet with Robert Wise, who directed The Day the Earth Stood Still. He was also the editor of Citizen Kane. Later, he made The Sound of Music and The Andromeda Strain. Robert Wise, who made The Day the Earth Stood Still, if you remember the film with Michael Rennie and Gort, the enforcer robot, he said that he believed that UFOs were real and were extraterrestrial because when he was making the film, some people came out from Washington who were in the know and told him, he was told a number of times, you don't know how real and true your film is. So he just couldn't understand the cover-up. I mean, in Day the Earth Stood Still, there's no cover-up. The saucer lands at the Washington Monument, and it's world news that day. But a few years, let's see, that was 1951, that film. Same year, The Thing from Another World came out, Howard Hawks' film. That was the Roswell incident set in the Arctic. Flying saucer crashes in the ice, and there's one living occupant, as we believe there was in Roswell. And the Army tries to cover it up. So that film was much closer to the truth than The Day the Earth Stood Still. This is me on the set when we were making Roswell. I developed the script starting in 1989, and our green light to make the movie was October of 1993. We opened production offices for Showtime. It was a 4-year battle of constant rejection. Along the way, once I teamed up with director Jeremy Kagan, so competent, he was such a great director for this movie, he was able to get us a deal at HBO. And they developed the script. First, they hired us to write a treatment to completely revise my original script. And then they hired Arthur Koppett, great playwright, to write the script. They put him through 7 drafts in a year and a half. And right when we thought that we were going to start casting and making the movie, they told us that they decided they weren't going to make it. That's, in Hollywood, that's called putting a film in turnaround, which is a polite way of saying, go take your movie somewhere else. And if you can set it up, they can pay us back for all the money we put into developing it. Usually they take 50 cents or 25 cents on the dollar. But Showtime miraculously really wanted to make this movie. They put a lot of resources into it. And suddenly, I was on top of the world, producing this movie with Martin Sheen. It's Kyle MacLachlan of Twin Peaks in old age makeup. And the book that Kevin and Don had been writing, I optioned it when it was a 17-page outline, and then the book comes out. This is the cover of the book that had the movie people on the cover. And I want to play for you the trailer.
Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947.
This local rancher just brought in a whole lot of, I don't know what you call it, but he claims it all came down at his place, and the sheriff thinks it might be something you guys sent up.
Our government encountered something.
Something, you know, top secret.
Beyond our capacity to understand.
Couldn't have been anything of ours.
I mean, how in the hell was that thing held together?
Look at this.
A power so terrifying.
It's as light as a feather.
I mean, what the hell are we dealing with here? Is it friendly? Is it hostile?
A secret so dangerous.
From now on, you're not to talk to anyone about this. That includes your family.
That rancher was threatened. The sheriff was threatened. They threatened me.
What the hell is this?
It could forever change the world as we know it.
What if people think that we are not in control of the skies? They'd be right.
Nobody is going to take you seriously, not without proof.
Now, it's time you learn the truth.
I saw the bodies.
What bodies?
Now, at last, you will believe.
You may be the first person in human history ever to see writing from another world.
It wasn't a lie. It was a lie.
I know what I saw, and it was not from this world.
You have nothing.
Martin Sheen, Kyle MacLachlan, Roswell.
It was a terrific success for Showtime. I was pleased to have a little cameo role in it. I was the Army photographer in the autopsy room with the alien bodies, and I discover that one of them is not dead. And the way I discover it is that it reaches up and it touches me on the elbow. And my famous line from the movie is, "Hey, this one just moved." So that was our alien, made by the company XFX, headed by Steve Johnson at that time. And our alien became very famous. It was on the cover of many magazines. And by the way, doesn't it look a lot like the alien in the movie Paul? Did you see the movie Paul? And the producers of that movie knew what I had to go through to get Roswell made. And I always wondered why they decided to call their alien Paul. I could never prove anything. There's Kyle MacLachlan on a French magazine cover. Oh, that's me in my role as the autopsy room photographer, leaning over a body. I arranged to donate one of our aliens to the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell. And I've been a contributor to the museum, and I frequently speak there. I'll go through this kind of quickly, but my father was not only professor to Jackie Kennedy, but also to Bill Clinton. And when Bill Clinton announced he was running for president, I got in touch with him right away. Wrote him a letter saying I supported him, and he wrote me this letter back. This is not just a form letter, okay? And this is personal. And he was thanking me for the support. Interesting, the Daily News put our alien up there with Bill Clinton, and Lawrence Rockefeller was working so hard to declassify the information on UFOs and to urge Bill Clinton to do that. And Bill and Hillary were photographed at a meeting with Lawrence Rockefeller. We know what the meeting was about. And then I took this picture of Bill and Hillary when she was running to try to get the Democratic nomination against Barack Obama, the first time before Barack Obama was president. Of course, Barack got the nomination. And my picture of them, this one, became the cover of a book by Grant Cameron about the Clintons' involvement with UFOs and disclosure, and other presidents too, and what they knew. This was a terrific additional book by Don Schmidt with Tom Carey, Witness to Roswell. And at that fundraising event where I took the picture of former President Bill Clinton, I was able to go up to him and talk to him there. Everybody was paying attention to Hillary. Poor Bill was lonely on the porch, just talking to the man that owned the house in the Hamptons where the event was being held. And I went up to him and I introduced myself as Dr. Jules Davids' son, and he immediately, that was the right thing to say. He really respected my father, and he asked me what I'd been doing. Well, one of the things I had done was I wrote the foreword to Witness to Roswell, and the subtitle is Unmasking the 60-Year Cover-up. And I had brought that book to give to Bill Clinton, along with this book, The Roswell Legacy, that had an affidavit in it by the public information officer attesting to the fact that there were aliens and that he saw them. And his affidavit instructions were open only after his death, which was the case. And I was able to give all that to Bill Clinton, and he expressed his interest in the subject matter. I sent him other material too, which he had received on UFOs. I was trying to get a good result from his administration, but there was no good result from his administration because the Pentagon and the Air Force were in control of the thing, and they released their totally false mogul balloon revision of the explanation for Roswell, and it was just false propaganda. We didn't get anywhere then. But this was, after Roswell, I began making these independent films. The first one is called Timothy Leary's Dead, uses the song of the Moody Blues. And I was able to do Timothy Leary's biography. How many of you know who Timothy Leary is? Okay, virtually everybody. It's his life story told with his involvement, and it showed at about 15 or 20 film festivals. A long line to see it up in the Toronto Film Festival. It was very, very exciting. There was a telephone book size pile of reviews of the movie, and a lot of them were good. Not all. Our first poster, that's the cover of the DVD. We made a life cast of Timothy Leary's head. And the reason we did this, he said he wanted his body preserved cryogenically. He said, if you let the worms get you in a coffin, there's no chance you're coming back. He didn't believe in spirit, afterlife. Now, he was interested in being brought back to life through cryogenics by the freezing of the brain and then thawing it out when science could cure your disease. But he couldn't afford the whole body, so he could just afford what they call the head job, where after you die, they chop off your head, and they preserve your head because they're not going to cut out your brain. They'll wait until science has more answers. And he had a contract with a company called Alcor to do that. And we wanted to film it, didn't know if we'd be invited to, so we made this plaster cast of his head, and we made a perfect Timothy Leary head. And we actually didn't quite know what was going to happen. We actually filmed his death before he died, very realistically, but in psychedelic style, so that it would use the music of the Moody Blues, and it's a very surrealistic scene at the end of the movie. The problem was that Timothy decided shortly before he died not to have his head cut off and not to go through with the cryogenics. He said, I've decided don't want to wake up in 100 years, surrounded by men in white coats, experimenting on me. And he said, particularly if it turns out they're Republicans. So we released our movie anyway because we were showing his death as he had planned it. And this is his scene on his head on ice in our movie. That's the head. And the problem was a lot of people thought this was real. But for us, it wasn't a problem. It really was a kind of a game because we felt that if the FBI and establishment is going to think his head was preserved, in spite of the fact that the public announcement was he was cremated, you see, don't believe the cremation story, then the question is, where is Timothy Leary's head, right? They would want to pull the plug, maybe, because he was such a rebel. We were in the Weekly World News. LSD guru's head is sawed off and frozen like a popsicle. I had so much fun with this. As a matter of fact, I was thinking of revealing the whole thing at the Sedona Film Festival. They were showing our movie. And I put Timothy Leary's head in the trunk of our car. And I drove to Sedona. And just before going in for the movie, I thought, you know what? There's bigger festivals. This is really maybe not a big enough film festival for me to reveal something like this. So I didn't bring the head in with me. And then we had a question and answer afterwards, and people said, someone said, Mr. Davids, where is Timothy Leary's head now? And I said, completely innocently, it's in the trunk of my car. Well, they laughed like you laughed because it's so ridiculous, it was a joke. But, that's where his head was, or at least our replica of it. So from that film, then I started making a series of independent films that I passionately wanted to do. I wrote a script called Starry Night. And I was telling you a little about this before, but this script I wrote, it was loved by many producers. Robin Williams almost made it. For 10 years, I was getting option money from different companies, even in Japan and Australia, that optioned the rights and wanted to make the film, and for 10 years it didn't get made. So I finally said to my wife, look, all the money I've been paid on options through the years, I want to spend that much and just make the movie independently. Well, we ended up spending a lot more, but we did make it independently. These are some scenes from it. I named my company Yellow Hat Productions because Vincent often painted his self-portraits wearing a yellow hat. And there's a part of the story where when Vincent comes back, he steals back one of his portraits that didn't have a hat, and he paints a hat on it. And the law is really upset that somebody has vandalized this great Van Gogh painting by painting a yellow hat on it. I started painting massively. I've done about 300 paintings. By the way, my website, pauldavids-artist.com, and it not only has about the books and movies and the stage play of Starry Night, but it has lots of my paintings there. You can see what I've been doing. I've had a lot of exhibits and in galleries, and these books have been published with my art. And so the next movie was The Artist and the Shaman. I told you about working with the shaman in Sedona as I painted. The Artist and the Shaman showed in many festivals. And my next film was The Sci-Fi Boys. Now that's me next to Fari Ackerman. I told you about how Jeff Tinsley's father took me to meet Fari, and Jeff to meet Fari when we were boys. We won his contest. And this movie is really about, the focal point is Fari Ackerman and also Ray Harryhausen and Ray Bradbury, the triumvirate, and how they shaped and influenced several generations of future filmmakers. Their impact was massive. And almost every person who became big in the field of science fiction movies grew up reading Famous Monsters magazine. And Fari Ackerman lived in a house they called the Acker Mansion. It had a great collection of all his memorabilia he'd collected through his whole life, of the science fiction props and books and lobby cards and posters. And I had visited him so many times. So the Sci-Fi Boys then tells the history of special effects from the very earliest days, and Ackerman's influence, and so many of the big filmmakers came in to be in my film. It's hosted by Peter Jackson, taking it right up to Peter Jackson's King Kong. This is the triumvirate. That's Ackerman, Ray Harryhausen, who made the Sinbad movies and Jason and the Argonauts, the original Clash of the Titans, Ray Bradbury. This is Peter Jackson, Fari, it's me standing in the back, Rick Baker there with the white beard. He's won 10 Academy Awards for special makeup effects. Fari discovered him when Rick was a kid and published his stuff in Famous Monsters too, and called him Rick Baker Monster Maker. That's Basil Gogos, that painted most of the covers of Famous Monsters. Fari had a great sense of humor. Here he is strangling himself with the hand of Kong. And he was a punster. He loved wordplay, words within words. Our film won the best DVD of the science fiction genre at the Saturn Awards. So that was a great adventure. I went right on from that to make Jesus in India. I've told you about the theory that it's based on. I was in India 6 weeks, traveled 4,000 miles across the country, based on this book, which had gone out of print. This is the reprint on it that I had Yellow Hat reprinted. Strange things happened during the making of the movie. I went to Yogananda's international headquarters with my producer from India and with Ed Martin, who wrote the book, and we meditated and we asked for the help of Yogananda and his gurus and their protection when we were in India. And when we were in India, we did really feel protected. It was like disaster followed us everywhere we were, 1 or 2 days behind us. I mean, we would miss a flood by one day. We'd miss an act of major terrorism right where we were, and we're out of there. It's a day later. These things kept happening. And we went to visit the locations of Yogananda's gurus, his param gurus. His guru was Sri Yukteswar, who had a hermitage in Puri, India, near the Jagannath temple, where Yogananda had studied. And Sri Yukteswar's guru was Lahiri Masaya, the guru before that known as Babaji. And somehow we went to Yogananda's birthplace in Calcutta. We went to the ashram in Puri. We saw images of Babaji when we just climbed into a taxi, and they picture of Babaji the way we have a picture of a Christ maybe in this country. And we were out on the Ganges River on a raft, and I said to the guy guiding us, you know, we've been able to pay homage to the gurus of Yogananda, but not Lahiri Mahasaya, whose legends are a great miracle worker. I said, I don't even know where in India he lived. And the guy directing on the raft said, really, sir? You do not know where is home of Lahiri Mahasaya? I said, in all of India. We got 4,000 miles. I don't know where he lived. I don't remember. He said, really, sir? He said, you look up on the bank there. You see that house up there with that yellow flag? That is home of Lahiri Mahasaya, sir. How do you explain it? He took us right to the home where the urn is of Lahiri Mahasaya's ashes. We had so many adventures in India, and when we got to Kashmir, oh, it was so dangerous. The conflict, the military conflict there. State Department had advised Americans not to go. We felt we had to go to complete the movie, and it was hair-raising. It's part of the climax of our movie. So there's Lahiri Mahasaya. In the movie, we have the Dalai Lama. We have Elaine Pagels. We have the Pope of Hinduism, the Shankaracharya. See it if you can. I also brought some copies of the music soundtrack and on CD, and I've had great music soundtrack scores in several of my movies. 3 of them were done by Brian Thomas Lambert, and that would include Jesus in India, the Sci-Fi Boys, and what was my next film, Before We Say Goodbye. And this is the one, I told you about it already, about the miracle of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the Hispanic-American family. And it does deal with miracles and afterlife. This is where we filmed. And that is the actual cactus cloth shroud with the miraculous image that has been studied by science, which is baffled by it. This is how you see it there in the basilica. All right, now I want to get to what was one of the most profound, life-changing things for me in this whole journey. And it resulted in the Life After Death project. And Sean Fernald, who I introduced earlier, knows a lot about this because he was not only music advisor and coordinator on the film, but helped immensely with the editing. And he saw firsthand some of the strange and inexplicable things that happened while we were making the movie. So here was the premise. You know, I met Fari Ackerman when I was young. This is my son when he was young with Fari. And Fari in his Acker mansion, that one was the night of the premiere of the Sci-Fi Boys. Well, Fari was an atheist. And he didn't believe in flying saucers, life after death, ghosts, you name it, he didn't believe in it. And he did say that, he said to me, and I know he said it to Joe Moe, you know, if it turns out I'm wrong, and I wake up to the great science fiction convention in the sky, so then he made a little joke out of it, and he said, you know, well, I'm going to be busy, reunions with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, and of course my wife, and George Powell. He said, but when the party dies down, if there's any way for me to drop you a line, I'll drop you a line. He had dropped me a line in life from like 20 different cities and countries. I've got all the postcards from him. He would go to a city and he'd just say, hi, Paul. Hi to you and Hollis. How you doing? Having a good time here? They gave me the key to the city. So I wasn't a believer, but he said maybe he would drop me a line. And it was an interesting thing to say because he was an editor, and what do editors deal with? They deal with lines, text. This was the last picture taken of me with Fari, shortly before he died. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sean, it was December 4th, 2008, just before midnight. Yes, that's right. This is his crypt. So how did my movie, The Life After Death Project, and then An Atheist in Heaven come to be? Well, we had a large tribute in Hollywood for Fari. at the Egyptian theater. I mean, every seat was taken, and there were a lot of dignitaries talking about him then, including Ray Bradbury. There was a message from Peter Jackson that was broadcast from New Zealand, and John Landis and Rick Baker, and little old me. I was one of the speakers there too. And there were two filmmakers from Canada who had made a biography of Fari. And, you know, a couple things about Fari. He loved publicity. He always talked about having his ego boo. Yeah, he had a big ego. He liked to call attention to himself. He loved wordplay. He loved word games, puns, words within words, names within names. And he would always emphasize that in the captions of the photos on Famous Monsters. Well, this becomes important. So the first thing that happened was that the two filmmakers that made the biography about him went to his crypt. Let's go back to, there's the crypt. And right before the tribute, they knocked on his crypt. They rapped on it, and they filmed themselves saying, "Hi, Fari, it's us. You know, we come down from Canada. We're going to show your movie to a lot of people tonight. We miss you. We love you." They returned to the hostel where they were staying, and one of them tried to blog something onto the internet where he gets a CAPTCHA code. You know those CAPTCHA codes with, it might be a word, it might have numbers, so you can prove you're not a robot before they're going to post something. The CAPTCHA code that came up was Ackerman's name. I mean, it was Ackerman 000. And these guys were absolutely dumbfounded. They had just knocked on his crypt, and it was like he was responding to them. And then what happened to me, a couple days after that, I was in my home, a vacation home in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Oh, remember what I told you about those stamps on my envelope from Fari? Santa Fe, the Office of the Governors, Edgar Allan Poe. In the course of the investigation of the weird stuff that happened in Santa Fe following that tribute, we got an EVP when we were filming electronic voice phenomena of a voice saying, "Lenore." That's Edgar Allan Poe in The Raven. He wrote the poem Lenore, and Lenore is the deceased beauty who's being mourned in The Raven. So we have this combination of Santa Fe and Edgar Allan Poe happening to me 40 years after I got the letter where Fari put the stamps on that was Santa Fe and Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, talk about weird. I had a document in my house for tax purposes, 23, 24 pages, listed all my phone calls, business meetings, lunches of the previous year. And I printed it out. And the printer printed it. I went out. I spent a couple hours at the casino. I came back. And then I fetched it from the computer printer. Well, naturally, the ink was dry. It had been printed 2 hours before. And I looked it over. There was nothing unusual about it at all. I took it upstairs to the bedroom, and I plopped it down on the bed. And I left the room for 5 minutes. And I was the only person in the house, and the doors are locked. And when I came back, that first page of that document had been changed. Someone had dropped me a line. That was the line. 4 words on the document were now blacked out in 2 different levels of darkness. You can still read the first 2 words, spoke to, but you can't read the name after that. And it's targeted. It's neat. It's obviously deliberate. This is not water from a leak dripping from the ceiling, smearing some ink. I treated it like evidence, and it was still moist. As I picked up the document, I could see it was still moist. I was dumbfounded. I was scared, frankly. I was scared. I really felt like I was in the presence of a ghost. And I wasn't thinking about Fari Ackerman then. I called out and I said, you know, whoever you are, if you don't have my best interests at heart, get out of here. I don't want you here. That's what I said. Well, I looked up what the words were that were blacked out. It was a name, Joe Amode. I had had one conversation with Joe Amode on that day. He didn't mean much to me. He was a film distributor that he didn't take Jesus in India, which is what I'd called him about. And I never talked to him again. Why does a ghost come to me and block out, spoke to Joe Amode? I thought what I needed was a manuscript that Fari had edited so I could look at his editing style and see how did he do it? Did he just cross out the word like with one little pencil thing? Or did he actually block out whole words? I'll jump ahead in the story and tell you I eventually found some definite Fari documents where he meticulously blocked out the whole words just like this. He didn't always do that, but I could certainly find examples of it. But in order to get a document, I called up his closest caretaker who had lived with him for the last 10 years, a dear friend of myself and Sean, named Joe Moe, and I called up Joe. And even before I could tell Joe, who had sort of planned the whole tribute, why I was calling him, Joe said, "Paul, hold on. Let me talk first." He said, "Weirdest thing happened to me after the tribute." He said, "It was, maybe you call it a lucid dream." He said, "I don't know if it was a dream. It seemed as real as reality itself. It was right before I actually woke up. But it was like my eyes are open, I'm looking around in my room, and Fari is there. And he comes into the room, and he speaks to me, and he says, 'Seen any good Hollywood tributes lately, pal?' And Joe said, 'Were you there? Did you like it? What?' And Fari, in his dry sense of humor, said, 'Well, yeah, it was fair,' which was a joke between them because Fari had a guest book in his Acker mansion that he called a ghost book. And someone once wrote a critique of the house down of what they thought of it in the collection, and they wrote the word fair. And Fari had gotten so enraged about that. He said, 'Would this guy call the Taj Mahal fair?' So it was a joke between them. And then Fari says to Joe in this reverie or hallucination or whatever you call it, he said, 'No, really, pal, that was the ninth wonder of the world. Thank you.' And why the ninth wonder and not the eighth wonder of the world? Because we think of the seven natural wonders of the world. Well, every monster lover knows that King Kong is the eighth wonder of the world. Fari's not going to detract from King Kong, so his tribute had to be the ninth wonder. So Joe wraps it up and he says, 'Paul, it was like Fari came and spoke to me.' And at that moment, as Joe describes the moment later, he said, 'Paul, it was like you suddenly put your hand on a hot plate. It was like, because it suddenly dawned on me that Joe Moe's name is contained in Joe Amode. And what was blacked out in my document was spoke to Joe Amode, and Fari had dropped me a line telling me he spoke to Joe Moe. He loved names within names. It was proven. I couldn't believe it. Yes, I was jumping to a conclusion, but I wanted science to get involved. I hand-carried the document for chemical testing. I see we are running a little out of time. I'm going to jump ahead. Okay. I took it to Dr. J. Siegel, chemist, head chemist, famous chemist, Purdue University, Indiana University, and he studied it, and he brought in this man, Dr. John Allison, College of New Jersey, chemists. They thought they would solve it quickly. They worked on it 3 years. They said, and went on record, both of them, as saying, this is a genuine mystery to science. They said, Allison, who didn't know me at all, said, Paul, when you came to me with this story, I figured I didn't know. Hollywood producer, maybe you did this yourself and you were having a fast one on me, which I certainly was not. But how would he know that? But he said his studying the mystery of the chemistry, he said, you couldn't have done this even if you wanted to. He said, I've had students trying to duplicate this. I've tried to reproduce it myself now for a couple of years. We can't do it. And the reasons he couldn't do it are explained in my movie, The Life After Death Project, and then the book that came later, An Atheist in Heaven. This was the beginning for me of what, in the book, I've documented about 100 different inexplicable incidents that happened in my life over the next few years. Sean was a witness to some of them. One of them, this was a mask of Fari's face that was in the Acker mansion, and I bought it at the estate sale. And on the day that I got the phone call saying Life After Death Project was accepted to be broadcast on the Sci-Fi Channel, I went out to lunch, and this mask of Fari, that for 4 years it sat on that very spot. I came back, and it was moved now 10 feet across my office. No one had been in the office while I was out to lunch. You can't explain that. This is the Edgar Allan Poe and Lenore. We had an African mask in the living room that really weird electromagnetic field from that mask. It's all in the film. We don't understand it, but I gave the mask to chemist John Allison. I didn't want it in the house anymore. Gary Schwartz has studied life after death at University of Arizona, Tucson for many years. And he became the co-author of An Atheist in Heaven. My next film, Marilyn Monroe Declassified, dealing with her life and death. I've discussed that already, but I will tell you that one really strange thing happened when we were making the film. I was with Philippe Mora, the director who directed Communion, famous UFO film, based on Whitley Strieber's book. And Philippe Mora's Mac, which is right behind him on his desk, was turned off. It wasn't just asleep, like if you leave it for a while and the screen goes dark. It wasn't that. It was off, turned off. But when you boot up a Mac, it gives you a little music. I can't say what it is, but a few bar tones. This Mac was asleep, and I laid out for Philippe Mora what had become my theory of Marilyn Monroe's murder. And just as I finished telling him what I thought had happened, that Mac booted itself up and no one touched it. Booted itself up, you heard the musical bar tones, no one touched it, right at that instant. The timing of these things is really important sometimes. Like there was another mask that leaped off my wall at a dinner party, everybody saw it. It went flying, like from here, over a lampshade and down and landed at my feet, and it did that exactly at the moment that I turned somebody's comment into a dirty joke that I know Fari would have loved. So I have two more incidents to tell you about as we go into the wrap-up. I'll spend less time on the first one, but I told you my dad wrote America, the World of Our Time. The house I grew up in, 4814, was the address. When my dad was writing Profiles in Courage in that book, and it's a painting I did of my dad with my daughter in front of the house. Formative years in that house. And the number 4814 in different variations keeps showing up in my life in significant ways. For example, George Powell's address was a variation of 4814. My son bought a house up on Mount Washington, and the address is 1448. Here's a letter from George Powell. His address was 1148 Laurel Way. When my mother died, at the funeral, there was a car at the funeral home, and the license plate was 41481 M1. Mother 1? I don't know, but there was 4814 again at a key moment. So that's important. This was before the internet, when you could find any old used book that you wanted that was out of print. You can now do that, but then you had to go to a bookstore and have them do a search. And I went to a bookstore called the Iliad, and eventually I got all those copies of my father's book by getting them at the Iliad. This was the Iliad bookshop on Lancashire. And one day I'm driving by there and notice somebody's making a mural right next door to the bookshop on the empty wall. And I start looking at the mural, and I notice that, I don't have a pointer, but right there next to Jerry Garcia, there's a manual typewriter. And it's the same type of manual typewriter that my father used. I showed you that picture. I told you about my book about Mark Twain in Hawaii, and this mural has Huck Finn and Jim from Huckleberry Finn. And, I went to Princeton where Einstein taught. I made the movie Starry Night, and in this mural it has Starry Night and Einstein. I made Timothy Leary's dead, which has a sequence with Jerry Garcia in it, and the mural has Jerry Garcia. I told you about how I decided I was going to be a film producer after I saw the Beatles' Yellow Submarine. Well, here's the Beatles in the mural. I had the Dalai Lama in Jesus in India, and here's a Buddhist up on that mural with the Buddhist monks. I told you about the paintings when I was a little boy that would be in my house, including this one of the Harlequin, Picasso's Acrobat and Young Harlequin. And that is also in that mural. And I started to think, is this whole mural like a message from my father? That since he's been deceased and he's honoring me for honoring him by finding all these copies of his book, and he's smattering all these things from his projects, and at the center of it is putting his own typewriter. And then I looked at the address on the wall where all this is happening, and it was 4814. That's where the mural was painted. And that was the house I grew up in when my dad brought me into all of those creative things. So that was a mystery. Now I'm going to close my talk with one more mystery that happened recently. My dear friend Jeff Tinsley passed away. It's about 2 years ago now. And we met when we were in third grade. That was Jeff, my best buddy in third grade. Within 2 years, we were making monster cards, filming these, and selling them with bubble gum to our kids, 2 for a nickel. And then we made the monster movies. So Jeff and I were inseparable. Jeff didn't come to Hollywood, but like me, he was into photography when we were young. He became a famous photographer, both of drag races. All of the racing car magazines would have pictures he'd taken. But he worked for the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and he became their premier photographer. He was the one they sent every inauguration to photograph the new president up there on the dais in front of all those thousands of people. Jeff was the closest photographer every 4 years to the president for his whole career. Jeff died of a brain tumor. And I won't go through the whole story of, it was a 10-year process. It was a decline. One thing about Jeff was that when he was young, he had made a scrapbook of the ads he cut out of the newspapers of all our favorite movies from when we were kids, which would be all the monster movies, George Powell movies, Roger Corman's movies, the Edgar Allan Poe movies, adventure movies like Hercules and the Vikings, and one of them that we loved was the movie Zorro. I'll get to that in a moment. You saw pictures of me and Jeff and Bill Goodwin when we were making pictures as kids. We were lifelong friends. That's me with Jeff and Bill. And here's Jeff when he was a professional photographer. Look at the long hippie hair. He went through that phase. And here's Jeff when he worked for the Smithsonian, the White House, presidency. And he gifted me the scrapbook. He wrote a wonderful dedication in it. And a few days before our high school reunion of just this last July, I pulled out the scrapbook. I was just thinking of Jeff. I was missing him so much. I took the scrapbook up into bed. My wife was reading, and I was showing her the movie ads. This was the long inscription Jeff wrote, I'm his best buddy in the world, and I'm the one that he bequeaths this to. And these are some of the ads in there. We loved the movie The Invisible Boy, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. Here's The Raven, The Time Machine. And then I point out to my wife, Zorro, the mark of Zorro. I said, you know why this is so important connected to Jeff? Because Jeff and I used to play Zorro together. His parents bought him the mask, the cape, plastic sword, and I had a plastic sword, and we would sword fight, and we would play Zorro. So I told that to my wife, and I put the scrapbook back in the bookcase, knowing I was going to be leaving for my high school reunion in a few days, and I was so moved, I just spoke out to Jeff. And what I said was, Jeff, where are you? I know you must be somewhere. I miss you so much. I just wish I could hear from you. You're not going to be at the reunion. You were at the last reunion. I just wish I could hear from you. I can't believe you don't exist anywhere anymore. The next morning, I woke up, and I went down to my office, and a home office, and I took out my wallet. I thought I had to go to the bank, maybe. I didn't know if I had cash. I think I was going to have to pay our maid that day, and I needed cash. And I pulled out the 20s, and the first 20 facing me in my wallet is this, and it has the word Zorro written on it. Now, I'd like to call your attention. The reason I blew it, oh, look, Zorro is right by the White House. Scott, Jeff photographed all those presidents. It's a good place to put it. It also happens to be near In God We Trust, but we don't know what that means. But here, look at the two R's in Zorro. I'm sure you'll agree with me that the first one looks like an R, but the second R to me looks more like a V, doesn't it? Look, it goes all the way down to the bottom. That could be a V. So I was on a search for Jeff's handwriting, and it didn't help me to read his dedication to me in the scrapbook because he'd written in all caps, but I remembered at the tribute for him that I went to at the Smithsonian. They projected pictures of him, including one from when he was a child. Oh, I have to tell you this. Okay. This was even before I investigated the R's. I plugged in my phone right after that to download the pictures, the new pictures in my phone. And at the top of the new pictures, it says new items, 676 items. It puts a picture of Jeff, Bill Goodwin, and Jeff's dad, who took us to Fari Ackerman, at the front of the new pictures on my phone. This picture was taken years ago. It had no business being isolated by my phone as being one of the new pictures right at the front of them. So that was strange. There's a little bit clearer image of those pictures. A lot of times when these paranormal things happen, they happen in twos. It's not just one thing, it's a double hit. And the second hit is like additional confirmation. Because just when you're trying to doubt that you saw what you really saw, something else happens that further confirms it. You'll see in the book, An Atheist in Heaven, I've got dozens of examples of that, of things that happened over the next few years. So I found a picture I had taken at the tribute to Jeff that this is when he was age 12, all about me, Jeff Tinsley, grade 7, favorite pastimes, girls and horror movies. I want you to look at the two R's in horror. It's a match. And ladies and gentlemen, there I end my talk.